Hey, hello, hello, hello. Good morning, Agnis. I'm waiting for your audio.
Hey, hello.
Good to
Is
talk with you
all right?
again. Sorry?
Yes, great. Just checking in the connection. It
Yes.
works. Good.
Yay. Being grateful for every small thing.
So where did we left last time?
Last time we were talking about the one-way mirror that scientists use to study and examine people. And I said, that's really useful for analysis, but it's that very distance that makes it hard to trust people. And so I think the last thing I talked about was like, if you want to change culture, you need something like a two-way mirror, in that we get to see the people who are promoting change as role models, and also know that they're actually in it with us rather than just manipulating us for their own selfish ends. And there was something in that that touched a reaction from you. And I'm
Yeah.
curious what that was.
Yes, and I remember we spoke as well about that there is this so people would rather have a two-sided mirror. That would be their default preference. At least this is what we generally would think. So we can see one way through, and then the other people would see through and see us. But then I think the comment you made last time was that in organizations, it's always the one-side mirror. So from the top, people always are willing to see clearly what's happening in their organization, and then it doesn't go the other way. So there is no possibility, or very limited possibility, for people to actually see what's happening at the top management.
Right.
And there could be,
But you surprised me with your initial assumption that people want a two-way mirror. I mean, I'm guilty of putting on my green screen because I don't actually always want everyone to see everything about me. So I'm curious where you're coming from with that assumption.
trust.
So in
That's
context
the,
of trust, or even let's use the word intimacy, we do want to see and be seen. Or even if we want a weaker word, community, right? If we're part of a community, we like to be seen and be seen. But even there, don't we always want to be seen at our best? Or usually want to be seen at our best?
it's all possible to the different degrees in the different communities and circumstances and places. But if we take all of that baggage away that we accumulated in our evolution and look at the purified version of trust and what does it imply, then it's quite clear. We want to be sure that we can trust. And what does it mean? There is no hidden agenda. And what that means, there is no hidden almost anything that would potentially invoke any kind of threat. And then if we start from there, just by conceptually, then this is the point where I'm referring to as why the two-way mirror is the alternative that possibly would be the most preferred for people, because that implies trust.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is that certainly in order to trust someone else, we want to see them transparently, right? We want to know what their motives and their intentions and their desires are so that we can accurately assess them. The implication should be that if we want people to trust us, we would welcome the chance for them to see us transparently. And I think that at some level, that is probably true, but I'm not sure I can identify exactly what level that is, because it's funny, you talk about our evolutionary history. What you're describing sounds very much like the Judeo-Christian myth of the Garden of Eden, right? And you start in the state of innocence and intimacy, but then you discover something bad, often about yourself, and then we find these fig leaves to cover ourselves. And that is the predicament we have found ourselves in for the last several thousand years. And I've often thought about what evolutionary trigger inspired that myth. Because there is this distinction you notice between animals who don't have this sense of shame the same way that we do as humans. And yet it does seem rather pervasive in our cultures.
Our evolution has many aspects and has given to us many, let's say, many good reasons to have this discussion right now.
I thought you were going to say it's given us many adaptive and maladaptive traits.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And generally, as a scientist, as a practitioner working with human change and transformation and how to help people achieving their changes in their lives or organizations, I always help myself to simplify things to the degree that they start making sense, and not only they start making impact. And why? Through the process of reminding people what they have internally as a powerful source of change. This is why I'm speaking about transformation gene recently. This is why I'm speaking about human energetic intelligence, and giving so simple tools that by just having that simplicity in the hands and heads of people, they would try it out. And what it would lead to is that they would experience, they would have a taste. It's like a degustation of a certain thing, and that thing is transformation. That's the transformation gene. That's the knowledge of change internally, which has been overcrowded, suppressed, and veiled with illusions and delusions that people maintain, that they are not able to do something, they have hard times, they need an extra motivation. You know what I recently realized about motivation? Motivation is a lie. So people, if they say, oh, I need more motivation, that's the first denial that actually there is infinite power and source of them achieving what they want. And it's not that they are lacking the motivation. They are either lacking the fit between what they really instinctively are willing to do and that target or that projection that it's either implied by the society or by the friends or by themselves, just to they would look would like to look differently. So therefore, I would say the trust starts from within. When people can trust themselves, and what I mean by that people can trust their instincts. I think over the last few hundred years, while our intellects have been evolving exponentially, we have lived with this perception that what we think and what we know determines who we are and who we are as a human beings. And therefore, this instinctive or impulsive or subconscious messaging, signaling is usually neglected. And there is lost the trust. So people sometimes don't trust their instincts. They rely on the analytical mind or rational mind, or they say, oh, I intellectually reviewed all of these possibilities. And from what I have listed, I believe this is the most optimal decision for me. And at the same time, there is this part in us which is responsible for the emotions, which is responsible for the instincts. And it can be also responsible for our survival. And it speaks, but it speaks different language than the rational. That's why Daniel Kahneman in his book speaking about the two systems. System 1, instinctive reactive survival. System 2, intelligent, rational, and slow. And predominantly, I think most of the people rely on their system 2, on the rational. And therefore,
I'm curious what circles you tend to hang out in. because certainly in the college-educated minority, I would agree with you that people prioritize the logical, rational system over the emotional, reactive system. My experience is that in our culture of education and the Western liberal tradition, that is the dominant myth that we like to think we are. I've discovered people who say that do not always practice it. And B, that is actually a bit of a conceit of the Western tradition that we are our intellectual, rational, reflective self. And I've also discovered, I went through this whole reaction phase of like, oh yeah, we just think too much. But then I started going in the other direction and discovered, my instincts are just as warped as my intellect is. And there is actually a bit of a dialectic, if you will, between them. And my current best conceptual model is going back to the Keegan's models of maturity. There's what I want, my desires. There's what I think, which is, my thoughts. And then there's how I react, which is my feelings. And attempting to identify any one of those three as the me and the self is maladaptive. It doesn't actually fit with reality. And I feel like in order to actually get to where you want to go, we have to posit some deeper thing. We could call it the spirit, we can call it the not self, we can call it the transformation gene, if you like. But there is this thing deeper in us than our desires, our thoughts, and our instincts that we have to trust in order to achieve, I think, the level of transcendence that you're seeking. Does that seem fair?
In any case, the story that I began was about the trust in yourself. And then I was getting into this exploration of the two minds or the two parts of the brain and all those possible implications. And then it was just remembering and starting point where we start with being honest with ourselves, with our instincts. And that's where the honesty starts. And sometimes people have lost that initial starting point. And therefore, if they have lived, in case they have lived the way that honesty hasn't been nurtured internally, how we would expect them to be seeking for this honesty and transparency and trust externally. And that was the idea. So it starts with you, if you have found yourself that trust or trustful relationship with yourself is the fundamental for your life, well-being, happiness, then naturally that kind of person would look for a similar values in other occasions externally, in families, in organizations, in societies. So that leads to people, if they are having this two-sided mirror, transparent inside of them, they would be anticipating and expecting the same level of transparency and trust in anything they do as an interaction with the world. So that's my hypothesis. And if people are differently living their life within themselves, they are more open to accommodate different kinds of mirrors externally. So maybe if people have one-sided mirror in themselves, so they, from the top, from the intellectual part, they're running the show and they are not allowing their instincts to pierce through the mirror the instincts just hit the mirror and reflect back to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
then it might be quite likely that these people would do the same with their organizations or with their teams or families. That's what I would think
Okay,
could
so
be
let me
true.
just to translate it into my own head, I'm going to use the word soul the way you're using the word instincts, because that helps me understand, I think, the sense of what you're getting to perhaps more than my conceptual bucket for the word instincts. And in that sense, people who actually prioritize their inner self or their soul over their external reputation and power over reality. What I hear you saying is people like that actually value their relationship with themselves in a sense even more than their relationships with other people. And therefore they welcome being seen because that is something that helps them achieve that greater level of selfness and connection, or at least tolerate it. Whereas if we have a false self that we are protecting, we will not want that to be seen. Is that at least consistent with what you said? Or am I missing something?
I think so. Of course, we have our ways to describe things, and then we try to interpret them and then try to get them somewhat understood on both ends. Except maybe the detail that I would always look from the angle of from within inside out. People would be having this transition of their model, their life model. So it will start with how they live within, and then that would be mirrored or projected or used in their interaction with the world, rather than the opposite. Of course, the opposite can always happen because the environment and the interaction with the outside world is one fundamental determinant of how people can change what they think and do. But generally, I think inner feeling, inner models are driving the people. And then if they face the reality where they cannot find a balance between their model, life model, and the model that is maintained by the other people in their organization or department or neighborhood, they would rather leave than to change their model to accommodate the outside models.
Right. So it seems like it would be useful to have a word for this thing you're describing, which is this sort of inside out focus and this personal journey towards self-awareness, if that is in fact the critical missing ingredient.
What do you mean by missing ingredient?
Well, you said that like in order for transformation to occur in an individual or community organization, people have to be committed to this sort of quest, right? Of being willing to face themselves or have this desire to, it sounds like we're painting two different pictures, right? There's people who are living this false self and don't really want to know the truth about themselves or other people, and therefore they're playing this shallow game, versus those who really actually care about their relationship with themselves. That seems like that's the inflection point of whether people really walk on this journey or not. Did I get you correctly, or am I missing?
Oh yeah, yes.
Right,
yes,
so that journey seems to be the critical thing. And it'd be good to have some language around that, if that is in fact the critical thing, so people can actually, because I feel like we're talking about something and we haven't even actually been able to name the thing we're talking about.
Good start.
And so the interesting thing to me is that this sounds very similar to a lot of the Buddhist Eastern wisdom traditions, right? In the sense of the biggest problem we have is that what we think of reality is really an illusion. And what we think of the self is also an illusion. And I'm curious whether you've actually, and Buddhism, at least around here in California, has become sort of scientifically trendy. People studying meditation, and not just personally, but also neuroscientists studying meditation and the effect on the brain. And I think somebody from Twitter or Twitter's parent hosted a Wisdom 2.0 conference a while ago. And that has some really interesting language and models for discussing this kind of journey.
I believe people are seeking balance in their lives. And as we evolve, our life experiences change. Technologies emerge, connectivity emerge, mobility emerges, different other communication channels emerge, and the seeking hasn't stopped. The seeking just has different alternatives or different enablers or disablers on the way. And the journey continues. And good that you mentioned all of the existing examples, how people naturally choose their way of seeking. And they have chosen the way that possibly was the closest to their minds or closest to their hearts or closest to their homes or closest in their relatives or the friends circles. Seeking is essentially the same. It's just a different path, different methods, different perspectives on that. So therefore, it's kind of maybe too loud to say that now it's trendy. I mean, trendy could be a specific path.
When I say trendy, I mean that, yeah, the study of Buddhism by Western intellectuals is a trend, right? And that is one way of seeking, especially in California, which is probably a good model of what's called a post-Christian culture. And it's not so much saying that it's necessarily right or even good or bad. It's saying it's interesting in that it is a place where there's a community of people who very much are in the Western intellectual tradition, who are also trying to find language and models to explain this sort of inside-out seeking. And I was just curious how much you were aware of any of that work going on in our attempt to find some language to discuss this.
Oh, not at all.
Okay. I'm swimming in it here in California, but I never know what's in California that's also elsewhere. But it occurs to me that if your business is transformation, then being able to recognize and cultivate an adaptive form of seeking is probably the critical success factor in many of your endeavors.
Adaptive way of seeking. By that you mean that the seeking continues, is just a question of the adaptability or the capacity to
adaptive. I've gotten to the place where I have this fight going on with binary, in that true and false as labels of categories I find problematic in many contexts. And so what I found a better way of saying is my mental model, asking whether my mental model is true or false is not very helpful. Asking whether my mental models are adaptive in that they converge towards reality or maladaptive in terms of whether they resist reality is in fact a more helpful way of categorizing things. And so when we talk about seeking, is this a good way, a bad way, a true way, a false way? I'm not sure I find those categories helpful. But I say, okay, is this way of seeking, because I think we all seek, but is that seeking, is that tradition, is that community you're in, is it adaptive or maladaptive? And that I find a useful way. I got this from an atheist at one of my previous companies who he and I would have. He says, I don't think about true and false anymore. I think about adaptive and maladaptive. I'm thinking, that's really good. I will adopt that. And I think, the moment we are in now, I think the divergence between adaptive and maladaptive communities of belief is becoming quite extraordinary.
Right.
Because I feel like we have to make a distinction, because if we want to see transformation in the world, we have to be able to know who's actually enrolled in that journey and who's going to fight that journey tooth and nail because of their concept of self.
What I've been doing and the way I've been doing my work is with assumption that there are people who would never be seeking and people who are always seeking, and then are these people who say, I would love to seek more, or I would like to find, but they are not really adapting that, or not adapting their behaviors and lives to that seeking path. So therefore, I'm not that much looking for who is really there, because I believe there are everyone. And if I can help with my work those who are seeking but not succeeding, then I feel happy about that.
So the way I think maybe the difference, if there is one between our perspectives, is that I see that I don't see people as tend to be always or never. I guess one of those binaries, but that what people seek depends on their context, the relational context, the organizational context, the cultural context. And therefore, when I'm trying to create transformation, for me, it's not a question of whether someone is a seeker or not, but in which contexts can I, to your point about trust, I think the trust point is critical. And at which points do they trust me enough to admit that they are seeking but not finding? Because creating that context, I find, at least for me, is extraordinarily difficult to get people to that level of trust where they're willing to admit that they're seeking something they haven't found.
And would you think that trust, of course, it combines of the inner trust and outer trust, especially if it's in a relationship where you, as you projected, there is this maybe conversation with a person, and then the expectation that people just at one point would agree that they are seekers or not seekers, or where they are in this seeking path. So that involves this, whether people internally have balanced out their trust towards that being seeker or not, and then the trust in the other person that they have the conversation with, whether that trust is supporting or contributing to increase the inner trust in that. That's actually would be also interesting perspective to look, because that interaction, inner out and outer in, and the same with the trust, inner trust and outer trust, and that's interaction. That's an interesting area to explore.
Okay, maybe that's a good note to end on, and we can, whenever you feel up for it, we can do a follow-up conversation on this inside out versus outside in.
All right.
All right, I'll find you on WhatsApp, and we'll decide when you're ready for another conversation and pick it up there.
All right.
Thank you, Agnis.
Feels good.
Very helpful.
All
Very
right.
interesting. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.